The problem is that whenever we don't know all of the story about something that's happening, our mind automatically fills in, oh, what if it's one of these negative things? And we start to believe that that's true. And it's just filling that in because it's trying to prepare us so that we aren't overwhelmed by a negative experience. But it's not a good way to live.
Cory Allen, I've been excited for this podcast for a while. More than grateful to be speaking with you today. I want to start with, you were starting writing music in your teens, and then you composed in your early 20s. How did you get down this path of now writing online, started writing books, teaching meditation? What brought you down this path?
Yeah, man. I mean, it was quite a long journey. So I started writing music whenever I was a teenager, as you said, and basically I was always interested in inner life pursuits, just because of the environment that I was in as a kid, and I found that by chance. I was in an environment where I was, there's a lot of emotional abuse and narcissism and things of that nature. And really out of luck, I stumbled upon kind of Western philosophy, and like no one in my house was readers. I just stumbled upon it in a bookstore and became really fascinated. And then after that, became really fascinated with Eastern philosophy. And I really related to that a lot more because not only was it the kind of the math of how I thought, but it was also what a lot of my intuitions were in terms of what I think is right and how you could be as a person in the world, or how you should be. And so, so I was always fascinated with that. And because I had, horrible anxiety and, anger, all these things whenever I was younger, like I would use the things I read in these books, and this is in the 90s too, prior to YouTube and Google and whatnot. So it wasn't like, here's 10 ways to do it. Was just like, read this dense, text about whatever and figure it out. And so it had very much an experimental mind of like, let me try this and see if this works. Let me start doing this and see if this works. And as I was doing that, and I was teaching myself how to meditate at the same time, I started noticing just a change in the texture of my consciousness. I started noticing that I was feeling a little bit less reactive. I was perceiving reality differently. And whenever that started happening, I became just obsessed. I was totally hooked because it proved to me and I had no concept of this being like, 15 years old or whatever, but it showed me that through learning and through increasing your self-awareness and self-understanding, that you can actually change what reality is like to you. And I don't mean that in even a mystical or metaphysical way. I just mean that your perspective, your outlook, your mindset can shift. And what's fascinating is that you can play a role in that. You can intentionally control it. And so I continued down that path and became fascinated with, psychology and neuroscience. And I really studied all of the traditions I could get my hands on, even Sufi mysticism, Aleister Crowley, of course, Hinduism and Zen, all these things, but just whatever I could fit in. I get into the hippie philosophers whenever I was a teenager, like Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna and all these people. And so I was really just like fucking with my brain. It's like let's see what this does. And oh, that's useful. That I'll remember that, and I'll go forward. And so I was always doing that privately. But the public facing thing I was doing was music. Those two things were very tightly woven together, music and my inner life pursuits. Like my music was this symbolic representation of whatever I was going through and experiencing in my inner life, but it was the way I was talking about it, I suppose, publicly. And so, like I talk about this in the book, but as an example of kind of how to find these interesting pathways, or I call them portals in your life to, move into that you don't expect per se, but turn out to be really revelatory. I was doing this, and then ultimately I figured out that, the experimental music I was making wasn't probably going to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And around that time, friends started saying, hey, like your music just sounds really good, and like the quality of the production of it. And I was like, cool, and they're like, could you do that to my music? Whatever you do to yours, could you do that to mine? I was like, yeah, sure. Yeah, I enjoy doing it. Okay. And so like that started happening. And then those artists or composers or whatever would go to, their friends would hear their music and go like, man, your stuff sounds good. And they'd be like, yeah, well, my friend Cory is the one that did it. And they'd be like, do you think that if I paid him $100, he would do mine? And they're like, I'll ask. And so a friend would be, hey, we do this guy's record for $100. And at the time I was like, wow, this is amazing. $100. Yeah. And so I started doing that, and that's whenever one of these moments, one of these portals where I was like, wait a second, like maybe the way I exist in the world of music, like as far as professionally, is going to be through production, not through what I'm writing. And so I started doing music production, all the while still in the background, woodshedding, just obsessed on consciousness and just really deep uh, personal exploration all the time. And I would talk about this with my friends constantly, but I I wasn't presenting it publicly in any way. And then about 12 years ago, I had a friend that had a podcast back in the Wild West days of podcasting, and he would ask me to come on his show. I was his first podcast guest, and he had a good sized audience, and his audience started asking me, like hitting me up through my music website, which is funny. And they were like, dude, you got to start a podcast.
Yeah.
And again, another one of these interesting portals opened where I was like, hold on, all I do is talk about my friends with this shit anyway. And I've got all the music production skills and gear sitting right here in my studio. So maybe I'll try a podcast for fun. I started doing it for fun. And within a couple of years, like I think 3 years, the New York Times reached out and was like, do you want to be in this article with Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan about podcasting? I was like, me? Okay, sure. If you're looking for bald white men, count me in. And if that's the criteria, yeah, so so I was in that, and then the podcast, got big, and again, in the background, as I mentioned to you, I was always like a crazy, voracious reader, from the time I was a teenager. I would read like, sometimes like 8 hours a day, just like constantly. I was obsessed. And I would read really complicated stuff, even like general semantics or really intense scientific things, or I was obsessed with like commentaries on the Pali Canon of like in Theravada Buddhism and stuff like that, just really complicated stuff. But I would just be like, okay, I'm just going to read the same sentence over and over and over until it makes sense. And I'm patient. I got all the time in the world. I'm just going to keep doing that. And so I would read all this stuff. And yeah, so I always wanted to write, so we're finally getting to your question. I just took us way back in time.
I love it.
And so I started thinking about it, and I was like, I got this podcast. Now I was doing that professionally, and I was doing kind of audio stuff just on the side. And I was thinking like, okay, like I think maybe now would be the time to start writing a book. And I talk about this in my new book as well. This moment, another one of these big, interesting portals that happened. And I was like, okay, that would be cool. And I had a sequence of events which occurred which were very uncanny. And on that, in regards to writing, and on the same day, a literary agent emailed me. I was like, "Hey, do you have representation?" And I was like, "Okay, well, this is wild. So I'll just follow that. I'll go through that portal." And so that's how I started writing. Really, it was like I got this deal, and it was crazy as I wasn't expecting it because I'd never tried to really write before. And I created a book proposal like in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that'd be cool if I could, sell it to a small publisher. And then fast forward like a month later, I had meetings with all of the big 5 publishers of, Penguin Random House, who I ended up signing with, and, Simon Schuster and HarperCollins and all these. And so it escalated quickly. And then, I released my first book, and then I wasn't really doing much on social media in terms of writing. I was still just like doing my podcast and just chilling because I never really liked social media too much. And, I don't no one wants to see any pictures of me. Let's start off with that. And also, I don't really take pictures. And
Right.
so I never really used my Instagram account. But one day I just thought, as a creative exercise, it'd be cool if I just wrote one thing every day just to make my writing better. And I started doing that, and like it just blew up, and I gained, like 500,000 followers in, I don't know, the matter of like 2 years. And so that's how I came to be writing about this stuff in the world.
Wow, man. Yeah, there's so many pathways I want to go down. Knowing that you started reading and going down this journey before YouTube, I think is a really powerful thing because it allowed you not to be stuck on one idea. And you talk about this in your
Yeah.
book too. I talk about this so much. We get so caught up in this story that we have of who we are, of what life is supposed to be, what life is going to be, that we just hold on to things and we're not open. We're not open to receiving. What were some of those early books that you read early on that kind of were like, okay, this is a mindset I could go down. This is another mindset I could go down. What were some of those books that really carved the path for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. I like that you point that out because, I think even today it's still very much, maybe it's more of a problem today because you have,
Yeah.
you look at social media or you look at YouTube or something and you're like, here's 1,000 different like styles or whatever. I mean, my answer to that is any younger person or I suppose if there's anyone elderly trying to break into to the game, any person looking to, get into that world is like, don't you can have your influences and people that inspire you, but you just have to be yourself, and it's going to feel weird and it's going to feel like you're doing something wrong. And this is kind of one of the secrets to originality is like your instinct will be like, well, I don't really see anyone doing this, so I feel a bit hesitant and scared to present this idea or this kind of thing that feels right to me in the world, because whenever you do that, you become vulnerable. People can, whatever, have negative comments about it or whatever. You feel sort of exposed and it just feels weird. And so whenever you don't see something else out there like that, it's really difficult to be like, I'm just going to put that out in the world. But that's the trick, that's the trick, because to be original, there can't be anything else like that. You have to be the one to be brave enough to go, you know what, I'm just going to put it out there. And it feels right to me. It feels, strong. It feels clear. It makes sense. It's what I want to be doing. Let me put that out. And that's how you emerge as a personality, as an identity, with someone who has a unique perspective, a unique take or style. But it just takes that courage and really it's not courage. It's more of an understanding. You have to just understand that's the way it works and to walk out into the ocean. As far as the early books go, the first like Western philosophy book that I found was Nietzsche. And I found that because, and what started this whole thing, my whole life, was that whenever I was a teenager, I heard, I was in public and I randomly heard someone say, if they could have dinner with two people, dead or alive, who would that be? And they said, Jesus and Nietzsche. Which that sounds like a fun dinner,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember, I had no idea who Nietzsche was, but I just heard that name. It sounds like a knife, like the edge of a razor blade or something, you know. And so, and it is, it turns out that it is. And whenever I was walking to this bookstore, and I just saw it on the back of a book, and I was like, on the spine, and I was like, oh, there's that word, there's that name, Nietzsche. Let me go check this out. So they had Beyond Good and Evil was there, which is an amazing book by Nietzsche. It's just one stick of dynamite after another, but be careful, what you're kind of opening, it's if one is receptive whenever they're reading that, it presents you with a lot of challenging truth, I would say. If you're not ready to grapple with it, then, caution. But that was definitely one, and I became obsessed with Nietzsche, and I was also like a total metalhead at the time whenever I was a kid, and so it was perfect. It was a match made in heaven, listening to Deicide and reading the Antichrist was a good combination, which is a book by Nietzsche, if people aren't familiar. And so then the Western philosophy side of things, memory serves. This is quite some time, amazingly. sadly, it's almost 30 years ago at this point. I'm getting old. Uh, but I picked up this book. If memory serves, it was by D.T. Suzuki, and it was called
Mhm.
Essays in Zen Buddhism. So D.T. Suzuki was um, one of the earliest Zen scholars and translators that people sort of forget that there wasn't a lot of cross-pollination between the East and the West, particularly even Japan and America, even in the early 1900s. It was still seen as like they're weird, on both sides. It's like this other planet, and there wasn't a lot of understanding of each other's cultures. And so to have someone writing not only as a Japanese scholar for a Western audience, but writing about really specific ideas that were only related to, Eastern sort of mindset was very, very avant-garde. It was very amazing. And D.T. Suzuki really helped usher in and get Eastern thought, particularly Zen Buddhism, introduce to the Western world, to Europe and to America. So he was amazing. He was a total G. He's a legend. But that in mind, keeping that in mind, he died in like 1960 or something. And so whenever he was translating these things, the books are, here's 50 pages on like writing around the idea of some classical version of what wisdom or enlightenment or meditation or something means. It's all very nebulous and, just giant blocks of text. It's not, there's no bullet points, there's no, there's no, there's no, diagrams, it's very intense stuff because it was just the earliest days. um it's like whenever you listen to like a folk song from way back in the day, from like 70 years ago, and it's some guy with a guitar, and you're like, oh, that sounds pretty basic. It's like you think from Getting There to like Future or something like that. Like the sounds of those two artists are quite different, and it's kind of the same thing. Like you had to start somewhere. um and I should say, for any just being a total music nerd, that was an example. That is not an accurate representation of, from a musicology point of view, of the lineage of where future sound would have evolved from, which we can't talk. I'm happy to talk about. I just want to clear that up. I do recognize that was just a random choice of artists. Anyway, so so reading that D.T. Suzuki book was really amazing. And then after that, I read. I remember reading because I was taking psychedelics, and like I would go in my closet as a teenager and like close the door and put a towel underneath the door so it was totally dark in there, and then meditate on psychedelics for like hours at a time, and just like the urban cave, um, and so I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and didn't really understand it. But then I finally found my way to like Theravadan translations and stuff like that, and that stuff really clicked with me. And of course, I came in touch with like people like Alan Watts and stuff, and that was really useful.
Yeah, I'm currently reading Why Buddhism is True. I can't think of who the author is at this current moment, but
It's
I think
Robert Wright. Oh, what's that guy? Robert Wright? I think that's his
I
name.
think it
Yeah.
is. Yeah, it is Robert Wright. Yeah, I knew last name was Wright. Couldn't think of the first name, but the the meditation that you started off. I know when you were 14, there was a moment where like your experience as a child seems as though it was very obviously very difficult, but just in a way that I like. It was conditional love is the best way I can, I guess, frame it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so knowing that, and then you dive into shrooms and meditating, I could assume that there was a lot going on in your mind, and a lot of people believe as though they're doing meditation wrong. It was definitely something I thought when I first started meditating a few years ago. And then you realize it's just simply the awareness that is the meditation in itself. It's not there's nothing you have to do. And that's the challenge with most people. Well, what were some of those stories and scripts you grew up with that meditation allowed you to become aware of?
Oh man, I mean, everything, literally everything. I mean, like the all of my negative thinking habits, in terms of having like feeling completely uncomfortable, having like total self-loathing. I was talking about this the other day. I had this weird, and I kind of still have it to a degree, but not, it's gone down 90%. But whenever I was that age, I had maximum self-confidence with minimum self-love. So weird combination. So I was really confident, but didn't feel like I had any worth. So figure that one out. And I mean, I sort of have figured it out. It's because whenever my environment made me hyper independent, and so from a very young age, and so that because I was forced to be hyper independent, it made me really confident because I could figure out and just deal with whatever I needed to. But the fact that I had to do that, what made it apparent that I wasn't being loved properly, and so therefore I didn't have the worth. Interesting combination.
Yeah.
But yeah, so all the scripts, man. I mean, I used my my cleverness to really try and dominate everyone and control the situations whenever I was younger a lot. Just being a real cocky, smart ass, sarcastic, but also funny at the same time. So you kind of could get away with it, sort of, at least in my own mind. But it's all out of fear, it's all out of fear and trying to, because I was so unhappy and so sensitive and so kind of wounded, it's like, if I put up this strong facade, it'll keep people back, it'll keep people away, and I can control everyone. If I can just kind of intellectually dominate people from the get-go, then they won't feel like they won't dare try and sort of, get to any part of me which was really vulnerable and sensitive. I mean, I just recognize, that, and that, my anxiety was just really it was all an illusion. It was through meditation, I realized someone that suffers from chronic anxiety, probably wouldn't want to hear this. And there's different types, of course. But for me, my anxiety, as I zoomed out more and more in my meditation, I began to understand that it was my projections and the stories I was creating about what was happening in reality or what was going to happen that was creating my anxiety. And something that really clicked for me that was hilarious was that I was sitting there in my room one time, and I was just super anxious, and I would be in a state whenever I was a teenager anyway, where my stomach would just be in a knot 24/7, always from just the fear and whatnot of where I was. And so I was I thought something and I got really anxious. My heart was racing. And then I sort of calmed down a little bit. I did some breathing techniques, and then I started thinking about it. And I was like, what is this? Why am I suffering? Just, I'll have a thought and my body goes crazy, and I get this fear response. And I thought, okay, what actually happened? There was stuff went through my mind, but in real objective reality, what actually occurred? And I visualized, imagined if there was a camera, just filming the room I was in. And I was I was just sitting here, nothing happened. I was sitting here, I had these thoughts, I freaked out, and then I was able to calm down again. But from the viewpoint of this camera, nothing took place. And that separation in my mind made, essentially what I'm talking about here is a distancing technique. It allowed me to take myself out of this, first person experience and see it from above a little bit, to put some space and some light in that experience of anxiety, so that I could see that it was just a symptom of my own imagination, ultimately. Just that I was picturing these scenarios and freaking out about them, and then I could process them into peacefulness. But just realizing that, oh, this is all mental projection. It's all me making these stories, mistaking them for reality, and then freaking out. And the meditation was really helpful in putting space around those things so that I could recognize them whenever they arose and begin letting them go before they overwhelmed me. And that's a really useful practice, because, and it doesn't have to be just with anxiety, but just with any of the assumptions or any stories like that in your life that you experience, because we're always, our minds naturally narrativize our experience, because this, one of the things is humans need to believe that the story is always going and that there's no gaps in it, right? And so or else we get confused and our consciousness gets weird and we, freak out. And like it wouldn't be very comfortable if you're like sitting in your room and then all of a sudden you like sort of were like, whoa, I'm in a subway train now. And then you're like, oh shit, I'm in a restaurant. Like what's happening? You need this narrative feeling of like, I'm going here. I will, so our brain is always like weaving together the story. But what happens is that like we have a series of, ultimately our bodies and minds a lot of times are trying to protect us. And so we have moments in life where we've felt embarrassed or negative or whatever the thing is. And so our mind is trying to prepare us in a way and project to keep us from getting into that situation again. So if there's a chance that we might encounter that, it wants to protect us from keeping us, in that situation. The problem is that whenever we don't know all of the story about something that's happening, our mind automatically fills in, oh, what if it's one of these negative things? And we start to believe that that's true. And it's just filling that in because it's trying to prepare us so that we aren't overwhelmed by a negative experience. But it's not a good way to live. It sucks because it means that in the present, you're living in this suffering-filled, kind of fear-based story. An example of that would be like if you text a friend and you're like, hey, what's up? How you doing? And then they don't respond. And then like 6 hours goes by, they still don't respond. Like, that's weird. And like a day goes by and they still don't respond. And you're like, all right, did I do something? And you start thinking about the last time that you hung out and you're like, what did I do last time? Like, what is, and then another day goes by and you're like, okay, like, are they blowing me off now? What, they're too good for me now? And then they text you, back and they're like, hey, what's up? I was traveling. What's going on? You want to hang out? And it's like, oh, cool. So that whole time for 2 days, I created this whole reality, where I was dreaming this, and it was just total imagination. So recognizing whenever that's happening is really valuable, because in the meantime, whenever you're, believing the story that you're experiencing that's negative, it is actually influencing who you're being in your life, right? So it's influencing like how you're carrying yourself, how you're talking to people, like the actions that you're taking. And that's really where you get to the real utility, other than just not suffering and having anxiety or whatever, the real utility of being aware of the stories that emerge in our lives and kind of how we fill in the gaps. Because how we how we feel influences what we think, and that influences how we act, and how we act influences who we are in the world. And so the less time you spend feeling frustrated or anxious or whatever about a text message or what's going to happen here, what might be happening there, the more that you'll be able to have this intentional and the sense of self that you're creating in the world of who you want to be, as opposed to one that's focused on anxiety and whatnot.
Yeah, the thought that gives us a false sense of certainty only creates suffering. It's like we don't have to suffer twice by any means, and that's what a lot of overthinking or overanalyzing, that kind of thing, comes down to. And knowing that you grew up as like you try to use your intellect as a way to kind of fight off all of the fear and anxiety that you had. You talk about this a little bit, I want to say in your book now, is that the existential paralysis, where it's like,
yes.
I definitely know that I went through a period of that. I think we go in and out of going through that, especially when you're so self-aware to an extent that sometimes I say it's like you have like it's to your detriment, really, when you're too self-aware, when you're always thinking about the next thing. You're always aware of how you feel, that kind of thing. How did you get out of your head and get into your body?
Yeah. Quite literally. Like, so whenever I was about 30, just to kind of fill in what you're talking about, yeah, I was in my late 20s. I was under the impression that the most important thing was just to become as smart as possible and to, awaken the mind as much as possible.
Yep.
And I ignored, things like emotions and exercise and the physical form and whatnot.
Yep.
And I started basically processing reality at a rate of a rate of complexity that was so much that it just became like overwhelming. And that's the existential paralysis that you're talking about. And I could go on and on and on forever about this, but literally, like, my brain would be, I'd wake up in the morning and like my eyes would open and sometimes I would start thinking and processing before my eyes even opened. And even more rare, but still it happened, is that as I would notice my mind coming out of the realm of darkness of like sleep and into crossing the threshold into consciousness and start processing. Sometimes I would be like thinking something in a dream, and I would like wake up and just notice that like my my mind is coming online. And I'd
Wow.
be like, all right. And then so I would just start thinking like, oh, my eyes are open. Well, all of these particles of light just like bounce into my eyes. My eyes are now processing this, and electrical signals are going through my retinas into my brain. That's creating this image that I'm seeing. But actually the image is being refracted. So it's like seen is upside down and the reverse inside of my eyeball. That's interesting. And I'm like, oh, I breathed in. There's like,
Wow.
50,000 oxygen molecules, and just on and on and on. And I'd stand up and be like, cool, all the blood in my body, just like I feel it cycling and moving. And then, I'd go and like turn on the water to make some coffee. And it's like, oh yeah, thinking about all the atoms expanding in the water, becoming hot and turning into steam. Like, oh, where did the steam go? Well, the steam goes and evaporates, and that moves into the atmosphere, and then that turns into this cloud, and that travels for how many ever miles, and that rains. And that's pretty interesting because that gets heavy, and then that creates rain. And wherever that rains, that water goes into the ground and then flows through all of the green matter, and then that green matter, so on, so on and so on. And it was just like, just constantly like that. And just became really intense. And I thought, okay, I'm just over processing like so much. I need to figure out how to get grounded again. I thought, what are like, at the time I thought about in terms of like, what's the kind of the birthright of a human? Like, what are the fundamentals here? And it was mind, body, and like spirit or soul or whatever you want to call that, inner life, whatever. And so I thought, okay, well, I've been focusing on the mind very hard for my entire life, and I've been focusing on like the spiritual aspect of things. I've completely neglected my body, right? And so I was also at the time I started gaining weight, and I was drinking like a lot in my 20s and 30s, but also but especially in my 20s, and not exercise. I'd never exercised at all ever, so I was gaining weight as well, and I was just like, okay, I think I need to just focus on the body. I need to get grounded, like literally, because my mind is just in the atmosphere. And so I started exercising. I started learning about nutrition and eating well, and doing yoga. And it's funny is that even the meditation at the time, it was all like intellectual and spiritual. There wasn't like a real physical component. It wasn't. I never wanted to be grounded. I wanted to be like off in the in the atmosphere. So really, it was the physical movement and the proper nutrition and just getting the body strong and as strong as the other two pieces. And so whenever that happened, it was incredibly valuable because it made it to where now I'm operating in balance. The mind, the body, the spirit, they're all working together. And then they can really elevate each other whenever they're all working together.
Yeah, someone that you've had on your podcast as well as me is Dr. Marielle Bouquet. I had her on the show, and she dives so deep into how we hold so much in our bodies from stuff that we're not even aware that we got, from our parents, from when we were born. And there's so much that we're just simply unaware of. And I can definitely resonate with just being in your mind and not being connected to your body. I think it's something that you talk about this in your book too. I think a lot of people are aware of what the spotlight effect is, but not a lot of people. You talk about the main character syndrome, which I think is really cool. But I think there's two sides to it, which I'm curious of your perspective on, because I think the confidence that you said you had as a kid, but you didn't have the self-love. When you feel like a quote unquote main character, there's certain times when you need to feel like that, when you're writing your book, when you're being a keynote speaker, like to have that confidence to show up the way that you want to show up. But there's a lot of negative to it as well, like the, just thinking too much about yourself. So how does that show up in everyday life and being able to kind of see the good and the bad for that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. To me, I think about it, and this is kind of how I describe it in the new book, is I think about it like we're all background characters, and so to me, it's like, because ultimately everyone is thinking about themselves as the main character pretty much all the time. Even if you say that you aren't or you're trying not to, you're still thinking about you other people from the perspective of yourself. We're all in how they relate to you. We're just always, it's the design of our biology to just be stuck thinking about us and being hyper self-focused. But whenever you think about the fact that everyone is thinking that way and we're all thinking about ourselves, it means that no one is the main character. And therefore it means that we're all actually background characters. That's the truth of it. And so, what's weird is like, if you think about even the most famous person that you can think of, I don't know who that would be, Taylor Swift or something. It's like people aren't going through the day thinking about Taylor Swift all day long. They're thinking about even her. Some people are, but generally people, but again, even her fans are thinking about how she relates to them. They're thinking about themselves in their pair of relationship to her. And so thinking about it and that the reality of it is that we're all, these background characters is very liberating, because what it does is it takes off the stress, it takes off the social anxiety, it takes the pressure off of like feeling like everything you do is like so important and crucial. And it just lets you kind of relax into yourself a little bit and get comfortable. And then whenever you can do that, then it frees you up to kind of get weird a little bit. It frees you up to like, no one's really watching. Let me just have some fun with this thing and kind of enjoy what I'm doing in life, as opposed to feeling like I've got, the camera on me all the time.
Yeah, our consciousness is the camera in itself, which is
Right.
another way that you've explained that. There's one thing from your book that I'd never heard before, and I don't think you've expressed it before, but the way that people speak, sinuses, their throats, the center of their chest. Like, I'd love for you to dive into that, because I don't think anyone that I've never heard of that in my life. I love your
Yeah, nice. Thanks for bringing that up. That's cool. And I apologize. I do have a little bit of like allergies. I was in New York last weekend. I got a little bit of a cold, so it's funny to me to be talking about the sound of your voice right now. I'm a little more nasally than normal.
Right.
Yeah. So I was just talking to a friend about that one day, and it's something I've thought about for years. And he was like, "Have you ever like written about that or talked about that?" And I was like, "I don't really think so." And he's like, "It's so cool, so that I put a piece of that in the book because of that reason. So basically, something I noticed as a lifelong sound producer is that, is the inner life study and sound overlapping and interweaving here, is I started noticing like the frequency and the place from which someone is speaking from has a connection to the general sort of state and texture of their mind. And if you notice someone speaking kind of from their face, where it's resonating from there, generally that person is going to be more uptight, intense, and maybe even somewhat anxious. At the very least, probably uncomfortable in themselves. Whenever someone's speaking from their throat, that's generally where people speak from. They're not really comfortable. They're not really uncomfortable. That's kind of just the natural. And then whenever someone is speaking from their core, from their chest, that's someone that's very, rooted in themselves and calm, and probably generally pretty aware, a self-aware individual. And that's the physical aspect of it. I think is really interesting. If you think about if you were to try and experiment and speak from those three places, you do feel this different sense of self. And it's like the kind of where the sound waves are resonating in your body, if they're coming from the face, you feel that like it comes from there because the rest of the body is tight. And so the only place left for there to be kind of sound to resonate from is the top of the body. But if someone's speaking from their core, there's a lot of room and space in the body for resonance. And that is an indicator that the body is very relaxed and open and dilated. And that translates to calmness and presence generally. And so it can be an interesting experiment to pay attention to where someone is speaking from whenever you're speaking with them, and you can get this insight into how they're feeling. And then with yourself, whenever you are speaking, paying attention to like whenever you get anxious and nervous, you'll notice that your voice probably gets a little higher. That's like whenever someone says, something happens and they go like, oh, I'm sorry. That's why people, they always raise their voice like that, or they say
Yeah.
it's because of that. You're clenching up and you're speaking from here, um, and so you can watch that in yourself, and you notice whenever you're starting to, get tight, you'll feel yourself, your voice rising and speaking from higher and higher, in your body, and then you can guide it towards your solar plexus and your chest, and you'll notice that it's very relaxing. It's like, I think about it as like it's like a mantra in meditation, but it's just
Mhm.
language as opposed to repeating a phrase.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really fascinating. And you break down some exercises on how to do it as well, which is really, really powerful. I think is so important. And I'm so grateful that you added that in because I think you said in your book where you haven't really spoken about that before, but I think a lot
Yeah.
of people need to hear that. Knowing that you've been a meditation teacher for a while, you've taught thousands in meditation, you've been a daily meditator for 25 years kind of thing. A mistake that you have noticed is that people mistake being peaceful as being passive. But
Mhm.
what do you find are the things that really make a quote unquote successful meditator? Like, what are those things that you notice in them?
Yeah, a successful meditator. Let's see. First, I say someone that does it consistently. That would be the big criteria. I mean, that's the thing that people struggle with the most is just consistency.
Yeah.
Um, which is really funny. It's always such a head scratcher to me. Like I get it. People get in their routines and they're busy, but it's like if you're doing this thing that is going to make you feel better and improve like every aspect of your life, why are you prioritizing that? You're sitting there in the kitchen on your phone, like scrolling Reddit for 15 minutes in the morning
Yeah.
and before you make your coffee or whatever. It's like, take 5 of those minutes and do meditation and like your whole day will be different. But, people don't do it. Um, yeah, I mean, I think a successful meditator is someone that does it. I think that doing, uh, keeping it basic is going to be really useful for people. It's going to, those people generally find success. People that aren't trying to get too complicated and too fancy with it, because there's specific reasons why one would want to make their meditation really complicated. Generally, people that try to make their meditation complicated don't know why it needs to be complicated. And it's basically coming from a place of ego or misunderstanding or something like that.
Mhm.
Really, it should be as simple because also the mind will just take care of the rest. Like it just needs to be as simple and steady as possible. And so for that, like someone, if they haven't meditated or if they feel like they're listening to this and their meditation feels somewhat disconnected or too challenging, really just sitting down and closing your eyes and just watching your breath, just paying attention with the focus of your mind, observing your chest rising and falling. And in your mind, you can think as you breathe in, you can think rising. As you breathe out, you can think falling. And in the place in between the breaths, you can think sitting. So if you're just thinking rising, falling, sitting, watching your chest move in, move out, etc., and you just keep focusing on that for 5 or 10 minutes a day, you're going to have, especially over time, because meditation pays in compound interest for sure. And it pays like that because it's, you're rewiring the neuroplasticity of your mind. And so you just begin to see that you are less reactive, that you're more present, that you have more mental clarity. And as that happens, it just turns into this feedback loop where it just gets stronger and stronger and builds on itself. But if someone were to do that every day, or even 5 times a week, they would really be quite successful. They would find success, I should say, by doing that.
Yeah, I think it's funny how we, especially as meditation, we meditate until we get to the point where we feel all right, and then we stop meditating, which is the
Right.
exact thing that got us to that point, right? Which is I find very ironic as well. I love your meditations are amazing as well. So if anyone's curious, that's why his
Thank
voice
you.
sounds so great. Is you do it yourself. Um, and so meditating for 25 years plus, like for someone that's getting started in meditation, do you advise that they get started in sitting with their thoughts, sitting by themselves, guided meditation, or like how has your meditation practice changed over the years, and what do you advise people get started with?
Hmm. Yeah, I've never done a guided meditation, which is kind of funny.
Mm.
Um, but I know they're really helpful for people. I know they really like them because they can basically the the responsibility to have kind of the logical part of it is taken off of them, so they can just sit back and just enjoy and be guided. It's really useful for people. In terms of myself, I started meditating because I was reading weird old dusty books in the 90s and just trying to figure out like different things. And a lot of the original writings, like the classical writing on meditation, they don't even use the word meditation. They use the word, like in the Pali translation of the word, is actually like dwelling. That's like a closer translation. And there's not clear, there are sort of instructions, but there aren't like the type of instructions that people would be thinking. It's like, sit down and dwell in your own consciousness until until you notice that you have no self, no stable sense of self. It's like, oh right, what a prescription, great.
True.
It actually is quite a good one, but may not be for everyone. So I started with that, and I've just gone. It's really interesting for me to reflect on, because at the very beginning, I was just trying to like calm down, because I was so stressed and anxious and freaked out all the time. And I was just always like in fight or flight mode. And so I remember like I would lay down on my bed and I would do this thing. I like created this kind of game for myself where I would like take a breath in and I would exhale. And whenever I exhaled, I would try and relax all the muscles in my body as much as I could. And I would inhale again and then exhale and try and relax them even more, and just see how much I could like let go. And what's interesting is that turned out to be a really powerful practice, and it got me out of being stuck in that amygdala brain fight or flight mode all the time, because I didn't know this at the time. But the reason why we're in this fight or flight mode is because we're panicking because of psychological reasons. But what our body thinks, because what the state of our mind is, that there's actually a threat, like a physical threat outside of us. So that's why it's like, oh, okay, and it holds on, it stays locked in that mode, because our mind triggers that mode because of something like a kind of a mental formation, right? I should say, something we've imagined. And so it triggers it and the body holds on to it because it's like, oh shit, there's must be a jaguar or something around here. And so it freaks out and it creates a cycle. They feed back on each other. So then your body is freaking out. And so then your mind gets even more stressed, and then your mind creates more, stories that generate anxiety. And so your body gets even more stressed. And that's why people just stay and they just like live in this long protracted state of anxiety and fight or flight all the time. But by breathing slowly like that, what's happening is that that state is called the sympathetic nervous system state, that fight or flight. Whenever you're breathing slowly, you actually move your body over into the parasympathetic nervous system state, which is also known as the rest and digest, which is like after eating, after going to the bathroom, after sex, your body naturally goes over into the state where it's like, because you wouldn't be doing any, if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, you wouldn't be doing any, unless you're a freak, you wouldn't be doing any of those three things if there was a threat around.
Right.
No one has a bear running at them with giant foamy teeth and fangs, and they're like, you know what, I should grab a sandwich. No, you get the fuck out of there. So anyway, so breathing slowly and calmly will send signals to your mind that your body is safe. And that starts to put you into this other nervous system state. And the more that you stay in the parasympathetic nervous system state, the more that becomes your natural state of operation. And so to get into the fight or flight mode now becomes as rare as whenever at one point you'd be like, oh God, I wish I could just calm down for a minute. Now it's the other way. Now it's like, it's hard to remember what it feels like to be in fight or flight mode, because of that. So I didn't realize at the time, but that slow, long, deep breathing, trying to relax the muscles more and more and more, I was doing exactly what I needed to be doing to start developing and cultivating that nervous system reset.
I think it's the most powerful thing that you can do in your life. I grew up similar to you in a sense that like my mind never stopped and I couldn't get myself to sit. So I did walking meditations. I didn't recognize it was a walking meditation, but I would just go on very long walks for a long period of time. And I find that walking meditations are great and you can definitely get a lot out of them. But when you're sitting with yourself and there's no guided nothing, it's just sitting with yourself. It's like the best internal vacation that you can possibly take. Um, and I find I can ascend the most when I'm not listening to anything whatsoever. And it usually comes around 20, 30 minutes in, not when you first get started. And that's the thing that's really changed a lot for me. Knowing you wrote your first book 2019, you currently wrote this one, and I'm so excited for everyone to read it because there's a lot of moments about meditation and so many other things throughout this book. Brave New You. I assume that you wrote this because there's a lot of people out there that know that they're meant for more, but stay condemned, like small, and stay in this life that they know is the life that they feel is meant for them. And I find that we have two goals in mind. We have the internal goal, which is to stay safe, which means we're going to stay where we are. And we have the external goal, which can never really override our internal goal because that's what is subconscious. So for people that want to step into the brave new them, what would you say is the path forward?
Yeah. I mean, the path forward is like what I lay out in the book. I think that really it is, first off, self-awareness is where everything starts. When you start to recognize that there is something that you want to change, and this notion of like what's possible, as you said, it doesn't have to be something huge. It can be something small. It can be like professional. It can be relationships. It can be, in personal, whatever. It can be a small change, or it can be a huge change that you want. But it's recognizing that there is a desire for more, for evolution and for growth there is really valuable. And then learning how to manage the negative thinking habits that you're in that limit you and keep you locked in that state of thinking, that mindset, which makes it to where that change hasn't been accessible for you. And then identifying precisely like what it is that is making you feel this greater sense of aliveness and prioritizing that in your life. Because a lot of people have this thing that they do that really makes them elevate and feel excited and just full of joy and what have you. But they generally feel kind of guilty for doing it, or a lot of times. So they'll be like, I'll do it a little bit here and there. Like, even if it's like someone likes like playing a video game or something, they're like, I feel bad for doing it. It's like, no, why? If it makes you happy, you know what I mean? Make it a big part of your life and see what happens, because that's going to affect all the other aspects of your life. It's going to improve everything, because if you're happier generally and throughout the day, then everything else is going to flow better too. So it's, identifying what's meaningful to you. And then I go into developing how to develop self-trust, self-confidence, and facing, the future with an appetite for more and constant growth and constant change, as it comes to you.
It was like I told you prior to this, I wrote so many notes throughout the book. It was a page turner. I read it in a few days. And there were so many things that I think people need to hear. Like the self-awareness is such a great place to start, because like you said in the beginning of this, the portals, if we're unaware of them, we're not going to seek them out. Like for you, I want to say it was the post that you made on perspective that really like blew up, and it was like it was a portal for you that just made you realize. And I have perspective tattooed on my arm because it was such a thing for me, where I resonate with you, where life wasn't happening to me, but it was happening for me. And it was only when I saw that portal that it allowed me to actually realize that and activate that in my life. So you wrote your book in 2019. You wrote this one. What book taught you more about yourself? I always love asking authors that.
That's a good question. Let me think about that. Which one taught me more? I would say this new one, because I was thinking like the first one, it didn't teach me. I suppose it taught me a lot about like what I actually thought. Because, writing is very self-clarifying in terms of your own thinking. Because generally, I experienced this when I first started really writing a lot, was we think we have ideas. Really, we have feelings a lot of times. So we'll get this little idea and then we get excited by it. And we're like, oh, this is a big idea. This is huge. but if you never go to and actually write it out in detail, you never uncover that there's actually not much there. So, you think like, I could write 20 books on this idea. And you sit down and you're like, I got about 2 sentences. And, so that was the self-clarification of thinking was really huge in the first book. And I think with this new one, I mean, I think it really showed me and taught me like what I was capable of. I think like how much I could really, how far I could go with something, and how much energy and work and thought I could put into it. And it also really taught me. It's interesting, is it taught me how to. It really goes into the subject of the book too, which is pretty good timing. But it's like with my first book, I had already released like at least a dozen albums, like records prior to that. And because they were weird and kind of small, I did them exactly how I wanted. I had very defined tastes and aesthetic and style. And everything from sound to the music to the visual aesthetic, everything was exactly what I wanted it to be like. And it always was. And so I just grew up, releasing albums like that, where it was like, the vision is mine. On my first book, I didn't really know, like when I'm working with the biggest publisher in the world, like how much I could push back. It's sort of this thing of like, even with you come up with a subtitle for your book, whenever you're working with a publisher that size, they don't go, okay, great. They're like, okay, we think we like this. We need to present it to a boardroom full of people who are the publicists, the marketing people, the finance, the investing people, the executive team, and everyone needs to agree that it's a good, and so it gets a little weirder. And there's so much that goes into a book with like even of course, the cover, the layout of the type inside, the structure, the design, the font choices, spacing in the book. There's like so much stuff that goes into it. And I was kind of like, well, let me try and just meet them halfway, because I don't want to, I don't want to come in here and be not a good collaborator or whatever.
Mhm.
And that was a mistake, on my first book. I should have been more forceful. I should have been more, I think, assertive. But I just didn't really know what was acceptable industry wise. And this time, it's many years later, I'm very different. And this time I went into it thinking like, well, this is like, I look at everything, because I came from this musical background. It's all a creative project. It's all like a piece of art. That's the idea for everything I do, whether it be, a social media post or a podcast, or whatever. It's all in my mind. It's all like a creative project that I'm developing. A lot of people, I think, approach it where they're like, this is content, or this is like I'm extending my portfolio or whatever, or but it's always a creative thing for me. And so for this new book, I was like, all right, I'm going to treat this like it's like, why wouldn't I treat it like it's one of my albums I used to put out, where it's like, I want everything to be just how I want it to be, And so that's the approach I took, from like the writing to what's in there to the title, the look of the book, the cover, the design, the way it's being marketed and sold, like everything about it is exactly, I just voiced my opinion. I voiced exactly like, this is how I want it to be. And fortunately, the publisher was super cool. And like everything I said, this is what I want. And they're like, awesome, let's do it. So that was a big one, because I thought like, well, why, if this isn't what I want to be like, why am I doing it? Because as a creative person, like, you're the one that has to live with it, for the rest of your life. And so that was a good, something that was nice this time around. And it really, goes into the theme of the book too, but just being like, this is what I want. Let's make this happen, and being very vocal and open about defining it in that way, and having it be a fully realized, creative project.
Yeah, well, you definitely crushed it with this book. I mean, the cover
Thank you, man.
is amazing. Like I said, I finished it in about 3 days, and when I went through it, I got to, I think, part 3, and I thought this could have been a book in itself. And then you get to part 4, and then you get to part 5, and you're like, there's just so much value in every part of the book. There's in every area that you can think of. You touched on it, you crushed it. And I want to be thoughtful of your time. There's one last question I ask every guest, and it's awesome that your book is kind of so much about not holding on to who we are, but being open to who we can become, and everything in that and what that looks like. And the question I ask is what belief are you currently unlearning?
Unlearning. Let's see. Well, first off, thank you so much for all the kind words about the book, man. I really appreciate it. Um, what am I unlearning? Let's see. I think in the moment right now, I'm unlearning trying to put too much pressure on myself for things because, with, of course, promoting the book and getting it out there, I'm just, I always I always press myself and push myself as hard as I can, with any professional project. And there's an endless amount of things that can be done, when you're trying to promote a book, and it lasts for months, So
Oh yeah.
um, giving myself some space to, take the foot off the gas pedal here and there and just reconnect with like why I'm doing it, and then remember to have fun. Like this, like
Right.
like this podcast is like, this should be fun, not
Yeah.
just like, let me come in here and tell you some prepared material I thought of. It's like, no, again, it looks like it's a creative project for me, approaching a podcast. So yeah, that's it. That's it. Just taking the pressure off and remembering to have a good time along the time.
Yeah, because the whole process of writing the book is the most difficult part. And now you have the other side of that, which is also like, oh yeah, this is supposed to be a fun project that I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
so
what's
funny.
funny about it, maybe I think I'm weird. It might be backwards for me. Like
Yeah, that's what
writing
I
for
thought.
me is really effortless
Yeah.
and really fun. Like I love it. But like having spreadsheets of like to-dos and stuff, that's like kryptonite to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense, man. All of your links, of course, will be in the show notes, but is there anywhere you'd like to personally direct people?
Yeah, if they go to bravenewubook.com, they can check out the book. And there'll be some cool bonuses on that page. And if they, any platform that they might have social media, people can go to just, hey, Cory Allen. And that's where my social media is.
Thank you so much for your time, brother.
Yeah, thank you, James. This is great.